this reluctance to let Israel take the necessary action in southern Gaza to finish off Hamas has been going on for months.
You don't see that as part of the same effort?
I don't think this is really an Israeli war against Palestinians or an Israeli-Gaza war. I think it's an Iranian war. And I do think people say, well, you can't eliminate the threat entirely. I don't know. How's Nazism doing in Germany today? Where's the international pressure on Egypt?
Well, I think that's a question, listen, as a former ambassador, that's a question that you can answer. Where is the pressure on Egypt?
When people say, well, we give them all this money and so on, and that's true, but we're getting returns on it.
A plan to provide billions of dollars in emergency aid to Ukraine and Israel.
We're not providing this aid to Ukraine because we're nice people.
So we've got two wars going on between the Gaza and Ukraine wars. It is a tumultuous time for foreign policy in the U.S. And my next guest, he's been at the center of some of the most significant foreign policy decisions in the last 20 years, none other than John Bolton. He's an attorney. He's a former national security advisor to President Trump and the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you being here. How you doing?
Glad to be here, doing fine.
Thank you. Let's dive right into it because you have recently said that President Joe Biden's administration is objectively pro-Hamas. Why do you say that, something like that, Ambassador?
Well, what we see in the administration's conduct vis-a-vis Israel is that it is imposing conditions on what Israel apparently wants to do, which is go into Rafah, really go under Rafah into the Hamas tunnel network and finish off the Hamas military capability. I think this is a perfectly legitimate exercise of Israel's right to self-defense. And I think that all the indicators we can see on the ground in Gaza say that until and unless Hamas is finished off, there's no chance for enduring stability, no chance to be free of terrorist attacks from Hamas. So I understand the concern about civilians. Let's be clear, moral culpability for what's happened to the civilians rests with Hamas. And I think ultimately the best interest of the citizens of Gaza is to see Hamas finished off.
Well, Ambassador, we're going to get more specifically talk in detail about Rafah, but I mean, in just the last few weeks, I just want to give a list of what the Biden administration has done. They pushed through Congress another $26 billion in aid to Israel, including about $4 billion worth of weapons to replenish Israel's missile defense systems. On top of that, another brand new $1 billion arms deal, which is being approved after Israel has begun its assault on Rafah, the last remaining city in Gaza. So how could you possibly say that that is pro-Hamas? How could that be pro-Hamas?
Well, I think there's incoherence in the Biden administration policy, which in the last few days, Democrats on Capitol Hill have been saying openly. They don't know what the administration's policy is. You know, when they talk about replenishing Israel's missile defense, I support it. I think it's the right thing to do. But it's not missile defense against Hamas. It's missile defense against Iran, which is maybe another subject we'll talk about. Mm-hmm. But this reluctance to let Israel take the necessary action in southern Gaza to finish off Hamas has been going on for months. And that's really what the issue is, I think. If you don't allow that to happen, if you think there's a role for Hamas after this war is over, if you think that leaving Hamas wounded but still able to revive itself, if there's any chance for Hamas to come back, that I think is detrimental to long-term peace and security in the region, and really restricts Israel's right of self-defense. It's a way of saying, well, you can defend yourself a bit, but not enough to destroy the real threat, which is Hamas's military capabilities.
I don't want to get too far off track, but you said it's for them to defend themselves against Iran. You don't see that as part of the same effort?
Well, I see what the missile defense capabilities we're providing are to defend against Iranian missiles. Yes, I think that's primarily it. I do think that this is part of a larger struggle. I don't think this is really a an Israeli war against Palestinians or an Israeli Gaza war. I think it's an Iranian war against Israel, of which at the moment Hamas is the tip of the spear, but which obviously also involves the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria.
Yeah. Listen, it sounds like you're saying, I'm gathering from what you said before, that you think this assault is justified, meaning on Rafah. And I want to talk more specifically about it, as I promised. There are more than 1 million Palestinians that are sheltering in Gaza. Israel has now amassed enough troops on the edge of the city to initiate a full-scale assault. So again, do you think this is justified?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely justified. And with respect to the civilians, there are other solutions here. For example, Egypt could open its borders to these civilians. Now, Egypt doesn't want to do that. And I can understand why not. They don't want to risk Hamas getting hold in Egypt. But what about opening the border in a limited way to allow Gazans to come out and go into refugee camps on Egyptian territory rather than in Gaza? The Egyptians won't agree to that either. Where's the international pressure on Egypt to allow this to happen? Not saying they've got to grant immediate citizenship to to Gazans leaving, but just to go to Egypt temporarily to get out of the line of fire. What's wrong with that? Where's the pressure on Egypt?
Well, I think that's a question. Listen, as a former ambassador, that's a question that you can answer. Where is the pressure on Egypt?
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's not a long-term solution. I grant you that. But I think I know why the Egyptians don't want to allow Gazans in, because they see them as an extension of the Hamas threat. In Egypt, they went through some time under the Muslim Brotherhood after Mubarak was overthrown. They see Hamas as a subsidiary of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they don't want to take the chance. I understand their logic, but the responsibility for the people in Gaza ultimately belongs to their government, which is Hamas. Obviously, the government of Gaza doesn't care a whit about the safety of its civilian population. So to say that others than Israel should bear some responsibility seems to me to be both logical and in the best interest of the Gazan people. But not even the United States government raises it because they know the Arab countries have a pretty strong view that they just don't want anybody from Gaza showing up in their territory. That's not Israel's fault.
Well, you have said that that Hamas has to be eradicated. Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu have indicated that they will not stop waging this conflict until Hamas has been completely eradicated, and that they plan to continue to occupy the Gaza Strip. How can they go about attempting to achieve a goal without continuing mass civilian casualties? That is a concern from everyone. You've seen the protests here in the United States and elsewhere.
Yeah, certainly they're concerned about that, and we're all concerned about that. But who's responsible for it? You know, Hamas has proven itself not just barbaric for what it did on October the 7th, but for how thoroughly barbaric its strategy of defense is, to put civilians in danger in the line of fire to save Hamas's leadership. That's what I think world opinion should be focused on. That's what's unacceptable. In World War II, faced with the existential threat that we saw, we leveled Germany, leveled it, destroyed the government. There was no government in Germany. And we did that because we felt until Hitler was eliminated, that there wouldn't be peace in Europe. And I think we were right to do that. I think Israel sees Hamas as a terrorist threat without whose elimination the country will never be secure. I don't think you can argue with that.
You're talking about Germany, but how is it possible to eliminate a terror organization waging an insurgent war like Hamas? I mean, something that the U.S. has failed to accomplish in 3 separate wars stemming back to Vietnam. How can this possibly end with the full capitulation of Hamas when such a strategy has failed in countless wars before, Ambassador?
Well, because I don't think it's exactly the same as insurgent wars, and I don't think the Gaza Strip is a country. I think it's a high-rise refugee camp. And I do think people say, well, you can't eliminate the threat entirely. I don't know. How's Nazism doing in Germany today?
One, you said, what kind of refugee camp did you say?
High-rise.
A high-rise refugee camp. That's an interesting perspective. Why do you say that? I haven't heard anyone say that.
Well, one of the tragedies of the Palestinian people is that over the years, beginning in the 1950s, they were in effect weaponized by radical Arab states like Gamal Nasser's Egypt and Ba'ath Party regimes in Syria and elsewhere to be used as part of the radical post-colonial Arab view that they were going to drive Israel into the sea, that if you kept the refugees, the Palestinian refugees up close against Israel, they would be part of how you accomplished eliminating the Jewish state. Now, over decades, that strategy has failed. Israel's not going to be pushed into the sea. But now the Arab states don't know what to do with the problem they've created with the Palestinians, as we just discussed with Egypt's unwillingness to take people from Gaza into Egypt even temporarily. And so what was created over a period of time, 75 years now, is something unprecedented, certainly at least in terms of post-1945 international handling of a refugee problem. You've created a class of hereditary refugees, the Palestinians. That's the only occasion of that anywhere in the world since 1945. And it's that dilemma that has to be solved over the long term, because the population in Gaza is never going to be a viable economy. This is one of the tragedies for the Palestinian people, that the Gaza is under the circumstance of continuing to press Israel and undermine its security. You're never going to get substantial investment by anybody in Gaza.
They would say that they're in that position because, in large part, because of Israel.
Well, let's look at the facts going back a little ways, because this tends to get lost. If you look at 1957, right after the Suez Canal crisis of 1956, the population of Gaza was about 300,000 people. Today it's 2.2, 2.3 million. Of that 1957 population of 300,000, 85,000 were Gazans and 215,000 were Palestinian refugees. At that time, the United Nations had a plan to resettle the 215,000 refugees along the east bank of the Suez Canal. It was ready to go. They thought they had agreement when Nasser's government said, we're not going to take them. We want to keep them in Gaza. And that was the end of it. But that's an example of how, if Palestinians had been treated like refugees all over the world, tens of millions of people who moved in the aftermath of World War II, refugee populations that were resettled, we wouldn't be talking about this problem today. But because of the logic of the radical Arab states in the 50s and 60s, because the UN acquiesced in it, we now have a hereditary population that's not treated the same way any other refugee population is. If you look at the basic humanitarian doctrine of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, their purpose is to provide protection and assistance for refugees until one of two things can happen. Either the refugees go back to their country of origin, which sometimes is impossible, as it is basically impossible here, as long as there's a state of Israel. Or if the refugees can't go to their country of origin, they're resettled. Now, that's not forced resettlement. That's what the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which won a Nobel Peace Prize for its work over the years, that's how they handle refugees, for their own good, for the good of their children, to put them in a stable economic and political situation.
Okay, so one more question then about putting, in relation to putting Gazans in a stable situation, because Netanyahu is being criticized by one Israeli general, and others, for having a commitment to a day after plan in Gaza. They believe that Hamas would be resuming operations in Gaza very shortly after they had been so-called neutralized. One of the generals is calling it a Sisyphean task. Isn't that the same lesson that we learned in wars of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Vietnam? It just kind of goes back to where it was after all the fighting?
Well, no, I don't think that was inevitable in Afghanistan or Iraq, and it's certainly not what the situation is in the Gaza Strip. It's clear to me that Hamas is analogous to the story of the death of Stalin. And there are a lot of variations on this story of the death of Stalin, but he and his ministers and advisors were out at his dacha one night when he had a stroke, fell on his back, and he appeared to be dead. Ministers began celebrating, even more vodka flowing than before he had his stroke, until one of his eyes opened. And the fear of Stalin caused ministers to faint, lose control of their functions. They were panicked until he was dead. I think the people of Gaza view Hamas like Stalin. They're afraid of him, petrified by him. And until Hamas is eliminated, until they know that they are free of Hamas, you're never going to get progress in the humanitarian needs of the Gazan people over the long term. Hamas has to be eliminated. And that's what the Israelis are trying to do.
All right, you mentioned Stalin, so let's pivot now and talk about another war, Russia and Ukraine. The United States has sent over $175 billion to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, including more than $60 billion in the most recent aid bill, which passed in April after a protracted gridlock in Congress. The war is being fought, and right now it seems like it is a bloody standstill, Ambassador. How long can we continue to fund this?
Well, I think there are two ways to look at this. The first is, has the administration followed a coherent strategy in dealing with Ukraine? And I think the answer to that is no, it has not. It has provided in episodic, non-strategic fashion the resources that you've mentioned in order to keep Ukraine from losing the war. And I think at this stage, you can say that that approach has succeeded. Ukraine has not lost the war, but we have not proceeded in a coherent way to achieve what we say our objective is, which is the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, i.e. winning the war. So what we've got is what is, conceitedly a wasteful approach, because we're deterred by Russia, fearful of a wider war. I think that's proven to be a mistake, but I would say, and there are many Republicans in Congress who say, why are we doing this? When is this going to end? How much is this going to cost? Much of that criticism is legitimate. But if you view...
I think that many Americans are saying it as well, and some Democrats at this point.
That could be. But if you view opposing unprovoked aggression on the continent of Europe, where the United States has enormous national security equities at stake, then you can't say, well, we've got an incompetent president, and therefore we're not going to defend American national security interests. I don't like having to go through the Biden administration approach, but I think the signal it would send in Europe and around the world that we failed to stop Russian aggression against Ukraine would endanger countless other allies and people in vastly different regions. So Is it frustrating and inefficient the way this has proceeded? Absolutely. Is it the right thing to do to provide this aid to Ukraine? Yes, it is.
Is it the right thing to do? I don't know if there's a timeline, but at what point maybe should, or I don't know, at what point should the Ukrainian government come to a negotiating table to attempt to make a deal? Should they even do it?
Well, I don't think they should, unless they're prepared to give up what was agreed to with the only truly democratically elected president in Russian history at the Belavesia Agreement in 1991, when the leaders of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia agreed to dissolve the Soviet Union along the existing lines of the 15 republics in the Soviet Union. Russia agreed to that, Belarus agreed to it, and that's what happened. And Yeltsin understood that meant giving up the Donbass, giving up Crimea, and that's what they agreed to. So if you don't hold to that agreement, every other successor republic from the Soviet Union is at risk of Russian aggression. And this is a very serious matter for the United States, given the interest we have here. You know, we're not providing this aid to Ukraine because we're nice people. Or because we're doing an act of charity. We're doing this because of our national security interests. And I would fault the Biden administration, and I'd fault Republican leadership in Congress for not explaining that enough to the American people. We're not just throwing this money away. This is helping secure our interests and those of our allies. And I'm not sure there is a timeline on that.
Well, I mentioned the $175 billion plus the $60 billion. And then there's, the commitment for Abrams tanks, battle tanks, anti-aircraft missiles, artillery shells. And even with that, Russian forces have suddenly made a significant push into Ukraine, particularly in key points like Kharkiv and Avdiivka. But my question is, other nations' involvements. You said this is because of our allies, protecting our allies. President Emmanuel Macron of France has alluded to the possibility of involving French troops in the conflicts. What do you make of that suggestion?
Well, he's kind of late coming to the table on that picture. At the beginning, he was trying to cut a deal with Putin, but I think he has been more resolute. Look, it is legitimate to criticize some of our allies, not so much for being more aggressive like Macron, which is unusual for him, but the Germans and others who have not really stepped up the commitments they made in the early days of the war. And I think more should be done, as any number of people, not just Donald Trump, but any number of Americans have for 30 or 40 years in the post-Cold War environment, saying to the Europeans, you've got to do more in your own self-defense. But here again, just because you have some allies who are freeloaders, really, let's be blunt about what it is, that doesn't mean you give up American national security interests. It means your diplomats have to go, and your president have to go to work harder on the allies that are not living up to the commitments that they made. That's part of alliance management. That's basic blocking and tackling. And we need to do it more, and we need to do it better. But let's also be clear, the Russians are taking a terrible pounding here. Secretary of Defense Austin said over a year ago that what's happening in Ukraine is effectively the Russians are feeding their army into a wood chipper. And one day that will come home to the Russians. I don't think they fully understand it. We've gained benefits out of this war, to put it in a calculus form. We've had weapons testing under combat conditions of some of our most important weapons. Our Javelin anti-tank missiles are performing magnificently. We're going to learn how well the Abrams tank does after substantial upgrades since the last time it was in combat in Iraq during the George W. Bush administration. And frankly, if there are problems, I'd like to learn them now in Ukraine rather than in some subsequent conflict. We've had reports American drones, for example, are not doing as well in Ukrainian hands against the Russians as we would expect them to do. Again, if that's the case, I'd like to learn it now and not later.
It sounds like it's a testing ground for U.S. ammunitions.
Well, I think it's important when people say, well, we give them all this money and so on, and that's true, but we're getting returns on it, maybe not equal to the amount of dollars we're expending, but these are benefits to the United States, to be blunt about it.
Yeah. Before we move on, because I want to talk about the former president and his political chances of becoming president again. But do you don't think that Emmanuel Macron saying that possibly they should send French troops, you don't think that will you don't think that will increase the I don't know, what do I want to ask? That it's going to be a broader conflict that's going to involve everyone, including NATO and what have you. And then, there is a possibility of a broader war in the world.
Well, I'm not sure how many people believe Macron when he says that to begin with. And I don't think there's any appetite within NATO. There's no appetite in the United States.
Right.
And we could have a debate about what the ideal way to do this would be, but we're 2 years into it. And I think the chances of ground personnel from NATO countries being involved in conflict at this point is close to zero. How much of what Macron said was for his own domestic political concerns, I don't know, but I don't see it as a serious proposition.
When you mentioned, members of NATO, some of them being freeloaders, that was a criticism you remember from President Trump back in the day, right?
And from Barack Obama back in his day.
Yeah. So you worked on President Trump's national security team. You were his national security advisor in 2018 and 2019. Since then, you have become really a vocal critic of the former president. In an interview with MSNBC, you described it as I quote here. You said, anecdotal, let's see, he is without philosophy and that he, quote, thinks in anecdotal, ad hoc, transactional terms seen through the prism of how does this benefit Donald Trump. So what would a second Donald Trump term mean for the delicate foreign policy situations like Ukraine and Israel?
Well, I think Trump is completely unpredictable for the reasons that you've just quoted that I've said before. He doesn't think in national security terms. He doesn't think in strategic terms. He can give you one answer in the morning and a different answer in the afternoon. Now everybody has their human frailties, but Trump has very limited vision and very little capacity to really, I think, understand what's at stake in critical national security areas. So
Are you saying he doesn't know what he's doing?
yeah, that's basically a good way to say it. And I've said that working in his White House was like living inside a pinball machine. And that's not the way you make coherent national security policy. So I'm very worried across a whole range of issues that he won't focus on them. He doesn't learn. He doesn't think it's important. He believes that relations between the United States and other countries depend on the relations between the two heads of state. So if he has good relations with Vladimir Putin, the U.S. has good relations with Russia. That's just simply not true. But that's how he sees it.
I wonder what do you think is worse? Is what you describe as Trump's transactional nature, doesn't know what he's doing, your words, the Biden administration's soft-handed approach. My question is, who are you going to support? What makes more sense to you? Will you support Joe Biden in the upcoming election?
Well, I don't think either one of them is fit to be president. And for different reasons in arms control, we call this they're incommensurable. They don't meet the test by different standards. It's an apple and oranges kind of comparison, if you'd like to put it that way.
Joe Biden, with his decades of service and being a U.S. senator, you don't think he's qualified? And being the vice president and the president, he's not qualified to be president?
Right. Well, I'll just quote Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense, who said he'd known Biden for decades. He'd never known him once to be right on a major national security issue. And I think his capacity is questionable at this point, and it's not going to get any better as time goes on. So I'm going to do what I did in 2020. I live in Maryland, where you can write in the name of an alternative candidate. In 2020, I wrote in the name of Dick Cheney, and I think I'll do it again this November.
You said his capacity is questionable. Do you feel the same way? And I guess you mean sort of his cognitive abilities. Is that what you mean?
Right.
Do you agree with that? Do you think the same thing with Donald Trump?
Well, I think actually with Trump, it's totally different. I'm not trying to compare the two. I think Trump's problem is he has no character.
What kind of a second Trump presidency, what kind of a problem does that pose to America's foreign policy platform?
Well, I think the incoherence and inconsistency of Trump's daily behavior is an ongoing problem. I think with the exception of COVID in the first term, which was a long-term kind of crisis, we didn't really have international crises in the first term. We had problems and issues, but nothing you could compare to a Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. Mm-hmm. And all I can say is thank God for that, because there's no way of predicting how Trump would have handled them. I think the world situation has grown more dangerous in the last 4 years. I'm not attributing that to Biden's policies or incompetence. I think things have shifted. I think we've moved into a Cold War period, a post-Cold War era, with the axis between Russia and China forming. I think it's different from the period that followed the demise of the Soviet Union. I think we're in new territory now, and I don't think the country as a whole is ready for it. I don't think any of our political leaders are really ready for it. But I think it's more dangerous for that reason, this combination of Russia and China and their outliers, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Belarus, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. We're in more dangerous territory now. And I don't think either Biden or Trump are capable of handling it.
Listen, I think people can disagree with you politically, but I do believe, Ambassador, that you believe in democracy. So I want to talk to you about Project 2025, this policy proposal intended to lay out a plan for Trump's second term. Stephen Miller, Mark Meadows, Charlie Kirk, all have contributed to Project 2025. Many of these suggested policies are overtly Christian nationalist. Having known many, and let me just tell you what some of them are. Trump wants to consider using the Insurrection Act of 1807 to activate the military for domestic law, as well as directing the DOJ to target Trump adversaries. He also is proposing dismantling the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Education, and the Department of Commerce. Includes banning abortion pills and pornography nationwide, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Are you surprised at all of you've known many of these people who I mentioned? Are you surprised at all this extreme list of policy suggestions?
Well, I'm not sure abolishing some federal departments like the Department of Education and transferring that function back to the states wouldn't be a bad idea. But I think they've got some very dangerous ideas, some of which you've enumerated. And I think that when we actually see what Trump does, it's not clear to me that Trump has internalized any of this yet. And how he would react to some of it will depend really on what he had for breakfast that morning. But I don't think basing an administration policy on Christian nationalism is a good way to start off. I mean, I'd be happy to talk about any of the specifics. I haven't read any of this 2025 material. I'm hoping it never sees the light of day. But I mean, I've been a conservative Republican since I supported Barry Goldwater when I was in high school, and that's still the policy I think we ought to pursue. I don't think that's what Trump's going to pursue because I don't think he has a philosophy.
Well, my ears perked up, and I think there are some raised eyebrows when you say that you don't think dismantling the FBI and the Department of Justice.
No. I said the Department of Education.
Department of Education. Okay, because I was going to say, how can you make the FBI send that back to the states? All right.
I'm an alumnus of the Justice Department. I think Chris Wray's doing a great job as FBI director. There are obviously reforms that need to be made. I could have told you those reforms back in the 1980s when I worked for Ed Meese. That's not what the Trump people have in mind, I think, though.
You're saying at Department of Education. Thanks for the clarification. I appreciate that. So just a few weeks ago, the former president also argued before the Supreme Court that he is immune to prosecution for crimes committed in office as long as it's in an official act or official capacity. An argument that the court's conservative justices seem to at least be willing to listen to and accept somewhat. What do you make of this?
Well, I don't think they're going to accept Trump's argument because I think it's far too broad. I think the answer they should come up with in this case involving the immunity that he claims for acts around and before January the 6th should be that what he did and what the other defendants in that case did were not government functions. And therefore, you don't need to get to the question of presidential immunity. What he did before he crossed the bounds into illegality was what losing candidates in elections all around the country do all the time. They file contests, they do this, they do the other thing. And everything that Trump did up to and including his illegal acts, like trying to find whatever it was, 11,000 votes in Georgia, were not official acts of the president. And therefore can be the subject of criminal prosecution if they go over that line. And there's no issue of immunity because those would have been acts that if he were a private citizen when he did them could have crossed the line into criminality.
So you believe what? And there should be limited immunity? Should the president
Look, I think this is a complex question. We know in United States against Fitzgerald, the court found civil immunity for presidents for their time in office. There's an argument about making sure the president isn't burdened by harassment from his political adversaries. But I don't think this case, and it's a very complex and important question because you want a strong executive branch. Mm-hmm. That's what the founders intended. They wanted three strong branches that competed for power, and by competing for power, limited the overall power of the federal government. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to disrupt that just because Donald Trump is a bad person. I don't think the court needs to get into what is, I believe, a complex and important constitutional question, because none of what Trump did, I've read the indictment in the January 6th case, none of it involves presidential acts. These were the acts of a candidate. Some of them were permissible. Al Gore challenged the results in Florida in 2000. I know it well. I spent 33 days in Florida. Gore didn't do anything illegal, but it was a drawn out process. And if candidates do that, I don't think that makes them prosecutable. But there's certainly what Al Gore did in Florida were not the acts of a vice president. They were the acts of a candidate for president, which he was entitled to do.
So you don't think the Supreme Court is going to rule in the president's favor? I think you said
I don't think they'll rule in his favor. I don't know exactly how it will come out. It looked to me from the argument like it'll be a pretty fractured court in terms of its opinions.
So do you think that, let's talk about that, just one last question, or maybe one more after this. So the case in Georgia, as it involves Fani Willis, do you think that is a strong case, considering what you just said about what the president did, asking for 11,000 votes, et cetera?
Well, to the extent that her case survives, and we don't know what the fate will be at this point, I think the same distinction applies. What Trump did, both acts that were probably legal and acts that may well have been illegal, have nothing to do with responsibilities of the president. And I don't think because Trump can't distinguish between what's his personally and what's the country's, sort of it all belongs to him. I don't think he understands the difference between official acts and non-official acts. But I think the court will, and I think the courts in Georgia would be able to do it as well. And to the extent they're non-official, and I think everything having to do with the outcome of the election were the acts of a candidate, not the acts of a president, that case would go forward, at least on that basis.
Anything else you would like to add in regards to Georgia, in regards to the classified documents, or the New York case?
Well, I've always thought the classified documents case was the strongest one. And in terms of the current,
you think that one will get to the courts before the election? And most people are saying no, but
you know, it's hard to say. I can't tell whether the judge there doesn't know what she's doing or she's consciously trying to help Trump out. I've never seen a criminal case proceed the way that one has, that's for sure.
Yeah, Judge Cannon, who is a Trump appointee. Are you paying attention to what's happening in the Manhattan courtroom now?
Yeah, look, I said on CNN the day that indictment came down that if Donald Trump were elected president, it could well be because of that case. I don't buy the legal theory in the case. This whole business with the litigation in New York, in the Manhattan case, and the civil case, has led me to question my previous support for having prosecutors and attorneys general elected by popular vote. I'm not sure that's as good an idea now that I can see graphically what has happened there. Maybe they should be appointed and confirmed by mayors and city councils and governors and state legislators. It's a mistake to politicize the justice system. And, you know, Alvin Bragg campaigned that he was going to get Donald Trump. And I just think that's a bad idea. It'd be a bad campaign. It'd be bad if he had campaigned to get Joe Biden. Just the wrong thing to do.
Well, it doesn't seem to be hurting him in the polls. If you look at the polls now,
I'm sad to say that's right. It doesn't look like it's hurting him.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. I appreciate your time.
Glad to do it.
Thanks for watching The Don Lemon Show. Make sure you click on the image in the top right to subscribe to my channel and the thumbnail in the bottom right to watch more content from my show. And I'll see you next time.